Slavery is said to have built the New World, but only in the image of a select few people. So let's investigate. How did slavery negatively impact both the free and enslaved population of Barbados, leaving a permanent scar on its colonial economy? Barbados was known to be the center of the British slave trade in the Americas, drastically altering the island's economy and forcing dependence on the colonial slave trade. Instead of becoming a self-sufficient community, which used trading as an alternative source of income, it became completely dependent on the trade of two resources: slaves and agricultural products, causing severe economic stratification, a job deficit for those coming into the island for new work, and an unsustainable trade-dependent economy. This is shown through the immense wealth accumulated by a small class of slave owners, and how their trade operated through the years. Slavery was a common economic practice for centuries, being used as a cheap labor force to maximize profits for large operations. The slaves introduced to America and Barbados were from Africa. The way slavery functioned was that bigger settlements would have a larger quantity of slaves due to their military power. Slaves were taken from newly conquered land to either be directly used or sold off in a market to destinations such as Barbados. Larger settlements on the coast had significant ports for trade and slave markets in their cities, through which African slaves would be funneled for sale to large enterprises, while other market segments provided traders with goods to import and export. This was a major factor in the start of African slavery, the most common form of slavery used in Barbados. The transportation of slaves, though, was a significant issue. From Cape Town, Africa to Bridgetown, Barbados, it would take at least 35 days at sea, and to get to Staten Island, America from Cape Town, it would take 47 days at sea. The long travel time, a limited number of supplies, and many other factors caused many slaves to perish in transport, and thus increase their price at market. Barbados was first discovered by the Portuguese around 1532 to 1536, and mostly used for the wild boar they introduced there, as a way of obtaining good meat and fresh water when they visited the island. The Portuguese soon abandoned it in 1620. And the English soon took control in 1627, at which time Barbados started its progression towards being a center for the African slave trade. In 1640, the labor force in Barbados was mostly composed of white indentured servants. During this time, the production mainly focused on a large variation of different crops, such as tobacco, indigo, cotton, and ginger. Later in 1660, though, there was a complete switch in both production and labor. Crops switched from a polyculture into a monoculture of sugar. The labor force also switched from being largely white indentured servants to being dominated by African slavery. The African slave population rose significantly after 1660. In 1670, they were 3/5 of the total population of Barbados. In 1700, the African population took up 3/4 of the total. During this time, the sugar production was also extremely high. Barbados produced half of the total sugar imported by the British annually. Professor David Galenson states that by 1680, the wealth of sugar planters was unmatched anywhere else in the British colonies. The amount of wealth that each plantation was producing was astronomical, as 175 planters each owned 60 or more slaves for their plantations. Even more expensive is the fact that most of the planters were buying massive amounts of slaves at the market, since the mortality rate for slaves in Barbados was extremely high. According to Professor David Galenson, recent estimates show that the migration of African slaves to Barbados accounted for 40 to 70% of the total population of the island, and 70 to 90% of the net migration to the island. This dependence on sugar and the slave trade had both its advantages and disadvantages. It was advantageous only to a select few people in the community, mostly the planters, as they would need to have a large and cheap workforce. The price of slaves themselves ranged from about £15 to £45 for males. In today's prices, this translates to £3,393 to £9,880. Considering that each planter would own at least 60 slaves, each plantation owner would spend in modern-day money $300,000 starting off, and most likely spending around $100,000 in new slaves each year. The owners were the richest people in all of Barbados, and their plantations helped them generate economic stratification. This meant that their wealth from the plantations and slave labor put them on top of the economy at the expense of the lower classes. This resulted in low social mobility. Slavery also took jobs away from the actual colonists and workers. The 60 or more slaves on the plantations would mean that they take at least 60 jobs from other workers who could have been paid to do it. The lack of available jobs for people created a larger unemployed or underemployed population, causing the lower classes to become poorer and increasing economic stratification even more. The slave trade in Barbados also created a trade-dependent economy. In 1672, the Royal African Company, or RAC, was formed. The RAC was the successor of the Royal Adventurers into Africa, which had only survived 10 years. The RAC was granted a monopoly over the slave trade in English America by King Charles II, even while being continually undermined, as it was difficult to enforce the monopoly. The company became the largest supplier of slaves in English America. The RAC brought an estimated 100,000 slaves to the Caribbean, half of which were sold in Barbados between the date of its formation and 1713. With 50,000 slaves being sold to Barbados, they would have spent approximately £269,668,927 over 40 or so years, £6,741,722 being spent per year on slaves alone. The plantation owners forced 75% of the total population of the island to help in expanding their riches by working on the plantations. The sugar on those plantations was then shipped to the British, making up 50% of their sugar imports, finally ending up right back at the beginning of the cycle, where the British granted a monopoly on arguably the most important cornerstone of their economy. Due to their trade-dependent economy, they were also dependent on Britain to import manufactured goods, as they were exporting most of their raw materials to the British. This trade-dependent economy was only a benefit to the plantation owners, as they could sell their product in bulk and increase their wealth, but only they would benefit. Any other business would not make nearly as much money on the island. Additionally, the slaves themselves were not permitted to play an independent role in the economy. Rather, they were used more as a stepladder by the owners of the plantations to further divide the economy between slave owners, the regular workers, and the slaves. Slaves made up to 75% of the population, meaning 75% approximately of the workforce was free or extremely cheap labor. They were provided very few resources by the plantation owners and were incapable of making a living wage and contributing back into the economy by spending. Since the plantation owners would barely provide enough for the slaves to get by, they would have spent money, although a much smaller portion than if regular workers were doing the labor. the flow of money associated with slaves was much lower than that of any paid worker. Any flow of money circulating in the economy is usually a good outcome, especially when creating a new civilization and economy, as it means that goods are being bought in a cyclical nature and everyone will have an income to support themselves with. The clothes and rags that slaves wore were brought from somewhere. The food they were given was bought from somewhere, and the tools they were given was bought from somewhere. However, even with the slaves' presence causing a flow of money in the local economy, the amount bought for them was still very meager. With regular workers, the flow of money would have been much higher in their surrounding community and a lot lower for the plantation owners, as they would have to pay workers. Slavery, however, caused this massive difference in the economy, leading to economic stratification. Slavery in the New World was almost exactly like this in every other country. The introduction of slaves into the New World caused economic stratification, a trade-dependent economy, and a deficit of jobs for those not enslaved. The slaves were forced to create wealth at a low cost for the owners of the slaves, like sugar plantation owners in Barbados. Slavery would be used for menial labor, like a plantation. The products they had collected were usually raw materials to be shipped back to the motherland, resulting in a trade-dependent economy and slave-dependent economy. The economic system which built the New World was not one which benefited the majority of the population. It only benefited a wealthy minority and acted to the detriment both of the enslaved population and the common worker. If you liked this video, please go and inspect the like and subscribe buttons down by the description. Oh, and also in the description we have some further readings about this topic if you're interested. Hope you have a wonderful day. Bye!